Hi there. So in this lecture, we're going to take a big sort of high altitude view of environmental laws and regulations. So let's jump right in. The history is there in that link for you to peruse if you want to get deeper into the details from our previous lecture, Life Before EPA. Okay, when I conduct this class in person, we have a discussion about what does the environment mean to you? So if I ask you that question, to write the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the environment, what do you write down? And what's surprising is there's some common themes. I guess that's not surprising, but there's also a lot of varied conceptions of the environment. And if we were to take this exercise outside of a group of environmental studies and SOHAS majors and just talk to folks on the street, let's say at Market Basket, we would get even bigger results. And so lots of folks answer things like, I think the environment is clean air and clean water. I think of the forests when I think of the environment. I think of nature. I think of mountains and going for a hike. I think of wildlife and protection. I think about hunting or fishing. And all these answers are absolutely correct. And so those are the things we have in common. A few people will think about the built environment, which is really important. And we often don't think about it, and we should, because we spend 90% of our time indoors. And then now things are going to get a little trickier when we start saying, well, who should protect it? Folks might say, well, the government should protect it. And then other folks will say, no, I really don't want government intervention at all, or as little as possible. People say it's up to each of us to protect the environment, but from a practical standpoint, that becomes complicated. And this is where we lead into, okay, what are all the many ways that we can protect the environment? Believe it or not, environmental regulations are just one way. And if you've taken ENST 253, environmental governance, I'm hoping you remember some of the other ways. Okay, so let's review those 4 overall ways to protect the environment. The first is this course, environmental regulations. And so one policy approach is government regulations, and we want the government to intervene to ensure that private businesses in their quest for profits don't destroy a public good. And so some of the pros of environmental regulations are that it's clear what's acceptable or not acceptable. The government prescribes actions, and this can prevent harm and distribute the risk and benefits of private operation more equitably. So we can achieve a balance in theory between economic activity and harm to the environment. So that's a big pro, and a lot of people like that and think it's the right way to do things. And then there's folks that, harp on the cons of environmental regulations, which is that because business is often innovating, there are so many technical challenges, and so it's a high amount of work on the government to stay on top of all the changes in technology and the changes in a business. And another con or detriment of environmental regulation is it's spread out across society. And so if someone experiences a direct harm as a result of, let's say, criminal corporate action, then that person can't get compensation for that harm. Also, there's a lot of transactional costs to enforcement of regulations, and a lot of businesses argue that it's too expensive to be in compliance. So a second way that has been proposed and actually exists in practice to protect the environment is insurance. And this is, let's say, you're a factory or a hospital or a defense base, and you have to have insurance on certain activities so that if there's an accident, insurance will step in and pay out, let's say, the cost of cleanup. And a great example of insurance that's used in environmental regulations is all underground storage tanks have to be insured before they can be operated by a facility manager. And this makes sense because if you have a leak of an underground storage tank, there's going to be significant cleanup and costs. And so they can't even operate without an insurance policy. So some of the cons against insurance policies is, well, some companies might say, hey, I borrowed the insurance, so I'm never going to inspect those underground storage tanks. I don't care, right? I've got the insurance to cover me. And also they are very, very expensive. So those are some of the arguments for why insurance just isn't enough. Okay, two other main ways to protect the environment. Hey, it's a free market, so let's let market forces decide. Let the consumer decide. For example, in this theory, then if a company is polluting too much, well, they won't be popular because consumers will find out they're polluting and then they won't pick their products, right? But this really requires every consumer to stay on top of what a company is doing. And as you know, that can be pretty darn hard to do with just social media and information overload, and we're already under a lot of cognitive stress and demands. And it's particularly tricky because, as they say, dilution is the solution to pollution. And so sometimes companies can sort of take their chances and they externalize the pollution onto society. They don't have to build it into their price. And, you know, they, let's say, dump contaminants into a river or improperly dispose of wastes and still, you know, charge very little for their product and take the risk of being caught. And so it doesn't quite work out when you have what's called bad actors or companies that are taking a more unethical approach. But it is the libertarians' preference to let market solutions decide everything. The cons for market-based forces, besides the ones I mentioned, it's that the only recourse for communities or individuals to get those bad actors to do the right thing is to sue them in court. And in theory, this is great because if a company can be found to cause damage, they should pay. And it does work this way sometimes. Monsanto just paid out huge settlements regarding cancer claims for Roundup. The problem there is those cancer claims are about 30 years in the making. So people have died, and it's their estate that have brought suit against Monsanto. It's also incredibly difficult to show cause and effect because workers could be doing other things in their off time. What if they're smoking cigarettes or, I don't know, they like to do stained glass and breathe in a lot of lead. And so it's hard to show cause and effect in the court of law. Also, it depends on if you've got a really good lawyer or not. And that's kind of hard to find. And that leads us to our last way to protect the environment, which is the courts, which is what's called common law liability. If a harm happens, and then you can, as a plaintiff, sue the corporation or sue an individual for compensation. And again, like market forces, the idea is, well, this will keep bad actors in line because nobody wants to get sued. It's bad publicity, it's bad PR, it also hurts sales. But some companies will take their chances. And so, as I mentioned, it's also incredibly hard to prove cause and effect. And so sometimes taking your chances can pay off for those bad actors. So this summarizes the four main ways of protecting the environment. There's actually a fifth way we learned about in environmental governance, and I'm going to ask if you can think of that off the top of your head, and I'll give the answer at the end of this lecture. So we talked about how deterrence was initially necessary. The whole movement, sort of that momentum that built towards 1970, and probably the most productive era of legislative action. The most important laws happened in 1970s through the early 1980s. And so this has resulted all these years later into an EPA that is very bureaucratic. There is extreme division of labor. It's incredibly hierarchical. And so you have experts in air, experts in water, experts in waste, experts in toxics. And you have a central unit in DC that does research and does sort of the leading edge science. And you have the political arm there where there's the lobbying and work groups and such. And then you have 10 field offices, which does mostly the boots on the ground doing the enforcement. Some of that enforcement actually gets delegated to the state, but we'll cover that in Module 2. The expertise is very technical, so you've got a lot of scientists and you've got a lot of lawyers. I mentioned how it's siloed and discipline specific, air, water, and waste. Really focuses mainly on fixed sources of pollution or factories, businesses, stacks, labs. It's harder to get a handle on mobile sources, but EPA does cover that too, with car emissions and car engine requirements, as well as trains, planes, and automobile emissions requirements. There's very little resource-based management or systems-based management, looking at an ecosystem, for example. But there are some programs. The wetlands program, for example, does look at habitat, ecology, species, biodiversity. However, for the most part, EPA does not really look at resource-based sort of protection. Very prescriptive, very much, okay, you're a steel mill, you will have this kind of pollution control in your facility. We will issue these kinds of air permits, and then we'll come in and do the enforcement to check on you. And so you have to have people to come in to do that enforcement. So that results in what's called high transactional costs. So when you click on this link, because it's not going to let me do it while I talk, but you'll see everything I just told you. So it's just a reference thing for you to check out that there's these 10 regional offices. New England is in Region 1. And then you have the Office of Air, and there's an Office of Radiation, there's an Office of Solid Waste, and whatnot, all those other offices. So it's kind of a big organization. Has it worked? I think that's a very reasonable question to ask, right? So all these years later, has it worked? And the answer is yes. Okay, we've had some major successes. We look at the pictures from life before EPA, and we kind of think about New York City and Los Angeles now. The air is a lot cleaner, and these numbers, provide the evidence and the statistics. Over 30 years, how much these air pollutants have decreased. Lead is down, sulfur dioxide, PM10, which stands for particulate matter of 10 micron in size, so very, very tiny, and carbon monoxide, all down. This is exciting. The water is cleaner. It's been very successful at stopping pollution from industrial point sources, so from industry like chemical manufacturing, pharmaceutical manufacturing, pretty much anything, steel, paper mills, and those sources of effluent or wastewater have been significantly reduced. We have less fecal coliform, so better sanitation, less phosphorus, so fewer algal blooms, and dissolved oxygen is up, which is great for fish and marine life. But, right, the hanging but, major issues remain. We still have air pollution in a lot of the country. Having 110 million people living in areas that have not achieved attainment, so we call those non-attainment, for both particulate matter and ozone, is disturbing, because we know that air pollution directly impacts lung and heart health. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about reducing air pollution is because for every 10 micrograms of pollution that we can reduce in terms of concentration in the air, we can add 1 to 2 years to someone's life. That's pretty significant. Talk about a great cost benefit. So mobile sources are difficult to regulate, and it's sad because we love our cars, but they're challenging to regulate. So that remains a big issue. Non-point water pollution. So not so much the point sources or the sewer pipes leading into the river, those have been cleaned up. Those are easy to trace, but non-point source pollution is runoff, let's say from a parking lot or from an agricultural field that then gets washed into the ocean or washed into a river. That can cause a lot of harm. The classic example of the harm is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is literally dead. I mean, nothing can live for, usually in the summer, it's like the size of the state of New Jersey. It's all dead. There's not enough oxygen to support marine life. And it's an issue closer to home in Chesapeake Bay, where 44% of nitrates and phosphorus that flows into the bay is from non-point source pollution or runoff. The problems are different now, okay? We've got the big sources, we've got the big angry stacks of pollution, we got the big polluters. So now it's smaller businesses that in aggregate contribute a lot of pollution. So those are tough to identify, and they're tough to come up with ways to think about controlling. So this is one of the cons of using government regulation. It puts a severe burden on the government to figure out how to fix the problem. And because of the adversarial nature that's evolved over these decades, business doesn't really want to work with the government. And so we might have reached an impasse. Other problems, those ecosystem level, big complex system level problems. Well, EPA isn't good at that because they're in these silos. And so for global warming and loss of biodiversity, indoor air quality, not so good. And dealing with how energy impacts environmental media, also not so good, because that's a complex system. And lately, I would say probably in the last 10 years, so folks might be like, well, what do you mean the last 10 years? The anti-science rhetoric has been building for a while. It's peaking now. I think it's got a lot more social media traction, but there's been just an anti-science rhetoric, I would say for the last 10 years, maybe the last 15 years, where folks just, I don't know, but there's like a lack of sort of faith in science or a lack of belief in science. It's definitely a politicization of science, so that's concerning, and I think we all have seen that manifest in the last 5 years. But it's making the whole relationship between science and policy much more contentious and much more difficult to get anything done.